I know BioCement pursued angel funding. What can you tell me about the journey, and what would you do differently, and what knowledge that you gained as you went through the journey that you could have looked back and said, oh, we would have done this differently?
Yeah. So this was the first time any of the co-founders had raised money for really anything other than selling cookies for Boy Scouts or whatever. So it was a huge learning curve. I mean, when you're raising equity, you're dealing to an extent with some SEC laws, and there's all sorts of stuff involved. Fortunately, what we decided to do, which there's pros and cons to this, before we decided to raise money, we knew that the co-founders didn't have enough business knowledge. I mean, just because you have a degree in business doesn't mean that you can, do a lot of this stuff. So, the first time, that you make a lot of mistakes. So what we decided to do was, we spent a lot of time, actually while we were still in college, before we graduated, trying to find people that could help us, which is super important. I mean, everyone should reach out for help for whatever they need. And we found some really great groups of people that helped us and were interested and joined our board, and then later the management team. But they helped us an immense amount in the fundraising process. I mean, we didn't have many big investor contacts or anything. I didn't even know where to start. We had pitched at a couple of local fundraising type things. There's one in Spokane. There's a couple small groups but they weren't all that interested. Our pitch probably wasn't very refined. So we worked with the people that are now really heavily involved in the company, and they basically showed us what we needed to do. And that's where we went back and redid our entire pitch deck and went out and started pitching. And they helped our CEO, actually, who was one of our first investors in the company, was the one that primarily actually did the pitching. Myself and one of the other co-founders, Nick, we did a lot of the actual development of the deck along with them, and they kind of coached us through the whole process. The biggest thing, if there's one takeaway that I learned that's really important, that I know that a lot of people make a mistake on, and we almost did, and I'm very thankful that they were able to stop us and explain to us what it is the difference between pre-money and post-money valuation. So people say, my company's worth $1 million. Well, what does that mean? Is that the value of all the shares, or is that prior to raising money? Because how it works is, if your company's worth $1 million, and let's say you raise $500,000, your company is not worth $1 million. It's worth $1.5 million. Because it's the total of the value of the company pre-money, which you hear that term a lot. Pre-money is the value that you raise on, the money, the value before the investors put in. And then if they put in $500,000, well, now the company's worth $1.5 million. So I naively originally thought that, well, if the company's worth $1 million and they put in $500,000, then they get 50%, right? That's not the case, because now the company is worth $1.5 million, and they distribute the equity based upon the post-money valuation, which is the amount after the money is raised. So in that case, it's $500,000 of $1.5 million, so it's 33%. So that's really helpful, actually, because you're giving away less than you originally thought. But that's really important to remember, at least with normal preferred shares, from my understanding, at least with a C Corp, that's how it works. So that's really important to understand, because when you're trying to calculate how much am I going to lose, you can, with raising, you can basically say, well, I would lose 33% of whatever I had previously owned as opposed to 50%, which really changes the equation as to how much you think you can raise. And that was a big point. That it's more just like a technicality, but I think it's important to understand. And then in terms of the actual fundraising part, I thought, so at a Series Seed level, investors, from my experience and my very low level understanding of it right now, is that they're more interested in the concept and the idea and what it could be, rather than the particulars of your business plan. It's obviously important to have a business plan, and it should be refined and look pretty, but some of them will literally just look at the financials and just say that's not even relevant, that's probably not even going to actually happen. It's going to be totally different than that in all reality. But it's important to at least think through the process. So building a business plan is very important, But just remember that when you actually go in front of a real investor that has invested in dozens of companies and have started several companies and have seen what actually happens, they're probably just going to say, I'm mostly just interested in the idea and the concept, especially at a Series seed. And if you're pre-revenue, I mean, anything could happen really at that point. So it's really important to have a vision and be able to tell the story of what it could be and all the verticals and say, it can be used here, 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 here. This is how we're planning to sequence them, which is also very important to say, we're planning in the first year to do R&D and then start to sequence into this market. And then, into year 2, we're planning to go into this market. And in reality, that probably won't happen. I mean, it's probably going to be some other formation, and the investors know that. I mean, they're putting in money because it's a gamble. It's basically like going to Vegas, but there's probably a higher payout, because you get to invest in these companies and you get to have that good feeling about these tech companies or biotech or green technologies. But so I think it's really important to understand that. I mean, I think a lot of what people are taught is that you need to have a very well formulated business plan, which is important. It is very important to do that. But the real thing is just being able to articulate that to people in a very convincing way and show them the big picture. That's really the most important part, is the big picture. Where can it go? What is the potential? Could this be used in Africa, or could this be used, could the Gates Foundation be interested in this, or whoever, whatever. Because a lot of investors are looking at more than just money. I mean, they don't need money at this point. They're just, in a lot of cases, I mean, it's great if you make $1 million off it, but if you already have $300 million, I mean, it's basically, it's like a rounding error. A lot of them are just interested in how will this help humanity and how will this improve people's lives. And so that's so important to be able to describe that to investors, as well as, all the numbers, because they need to make sure that you can do basic math and everything, But yeah, so that's kind of long-winded, but that's at least what I've seen. It's a lot, it's like a very art and science put together, but it's a lot of art, really, from my understanding. And I didn't do a lot of the pitching. It was mostly our CEO, but this is just kind of secondhand knowledge, I guess, from what he's told me and what I've seen. So.
My last question in this regard is preferred shares versus common shares. Mm-hmm. I suppose both of them are now in place in BioCement.
Yeah, so from my understanding, generally speaking, common shares are what you would get as a co-founder. So you start the company, you got 4 people, you issue 1 million shares, each person gets 250,000 shares, which, by the way, I don't recommend. You probably shouldn't just evenly distribute it, but that's a whole different conversation. But the common shares is basically a lower class of shares, I think is what they call it. It doesn't have as many rights. Basically, if the company does incredibly well and there's a surplus of money when the company sells, then the common shareholders get their distributions. Preferred shareholders, which is what an investor would be, so let's say you're raising some money, you're raising $100,000 or whatever to really start your business, then that you're going to be issuing most likely preferred shares, which is a higher class of shares. And it gives you just more protection and better provision. So, for instance, at least with ours, which I think is relatively common, if the company has to liquidate for whatever reason, the investors get, whatever money is remaining back, and the common shareholders would get nothing, which is totally fair, because they're the ones that actually put in money. Sweat equity is obviously valuable as well, but the legal system tends to be more on whoever put in the money, would get a little bit of money back, if it goes upside down. There's all sorts of provisions. A lot of times we'll have dividends, which can be distributed, from my understanding, in the form of either cash or additional equity, I think. It's just a higher class, that's what the investors get. And
they get the voting rights as well?
They do, yep. In most cases, you would have voting rights. And it's also important to note on the voting rights, usually every time you raise a round of funding, you're going to be given up a board seat, which is a different level of voting rights. The board actually directs the company. You think the CEO directs the company, the board directs the company, and the CEO listens and just tries to manage the day-to-day, or the vision and everything. So that's very important to remember, is that you're giving up voting rights in terms of their shares, because their shares have voting rights, but also you're most likely going to have to give a board seat, at least to a sophisticated group of, a consortium of angel investors, for instance. Usually they have one person that sits on the boards, and that's their job. They sit on the boards and they watch and make sure that the money is being spent properly. So, but a board seat is incredibly valuable. I mean, they're the ones ultimately running the company, so you have to be conscious of who you're raising money from, and make sure that they have similar goals and similar vision as you, because it hasn't happened to us, but I'm sure it can go sideways quickly if you go to maybe a VC firm that doesn't have the same vision as you, or angel investors is a little bit easier. They're they don't have quite as profit driven, from my understanding, as a motive as VCs, but it's still important to remember who you're giving ownership to and who you're giving voting rights to.